So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to first of all thank the UCLA teams that are involved in this. You're going to hear from them today and more about the research that they're doing there. UCLA in general is doing exceptional work in this area around sustainability and climate change and carbon accounting. And so it's an honor to be with the UCLA team on this third webinar of 4. From procurement to disclosure, how the construction real estate sector shapes supplier reporting. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about this background of these webinars so that you all understand where this is coming from. These hyperlinks will be shared with you through the chat function, but you're also going to have access to them here. Basically, how we started this process was thinking about how the world is playing out in the way of procurement and supply chain management. Very interesting things have happened over the course of literally the last 15 plus years in our field, but they're getting much more dynamic in the last couple of years as laws come online in different jurisdictions around the world and as laws come online here in California. I'm going to let the presenters introduce themselves as they come up, but so that you know who is here today. I'll be moderating throughout the process. There'll be times where we go away from slides and go to just one-on-one conversations, but you can see Tyson Timmer will be coming up first. Tim Kawahara will be next. Raven Adams and Deanne Hurd is playing my cleanup batter for a special part of this program that connects what we're doing in sustainability to the board of directors. And it also connects a group called NACD to UCLA, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, article that you can grab and take a look at tells this story of procurement way back during multiple administrations ago. The federal government itself thinks about procurement through a resilience lens, especially the Department of Defense. When you've got troops out there in the field, how do you maintain the supply chains? How do you make sure things are safe and that you're in strategic command of the situation, right? There was a point in time when an agency called the General Services Administration put up a scorecard like this. This scorecard went up around 2010, 2011 originally. And at that time, I happened to be working for the Global Reporting Initiative, and I was back in DC quite often meeting with the people that put this together. Why? Because many of the suppliers on this initial list were also sustainability reporters using something called the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. This was an inspirational moment for all of us that work in this field because the power of a relationship between a large institutional customer, like the US government, and its supply chain is incredibly influential. Just by putting up the scorecard sent a pretty interesting signal to the world, and it was made public for us because we're taxpayers and it's a public institution doing it. Well, fast forward a couple more years, just in 2021, not that long ago, but maybe feels like a long time ago given the way the world has changed, the UK government, through their National Health Service, puts out an RFP, a request for proposals, to a bunch of medical equipment companies and says, we're buying for the UK's health service. We would like to see your cost of goods that we're going to buy, like to see things like price. Oh, and by the way, we'd like to see your scope 1, 2, and 3 numbers, how you got those numbers, the methodology, and whether or not you had any of those numbers verified. This was a very, very loud signal to the market, and not only to the market in general in the US, but globally. It's the UK's National Health Service that's putting out this kind of request. So as we go through this process, we're thinking about, wonder what happens if we look at the state of California's own supply chain. 4th largest economy in the world. It's passing some interesting climate-related rules. It has a scope 3 itself. Large suppliers are in that scope 3. As a taxpayer in California, I went to the Department of General Services, started talking to some people there. We partnered with the Governance and Accountability Institute and with Ceres and with Carbon Accountable and Persephone to put together this study of the major suppliers based on spend to the California government. Now, those of you that work in our field of climate change and carbon accounting, this is your scope 3 starting point. Who are the suppliers? Who is category 1 to the state of California? Now, last year, Senate Bill 755 was put forward, didn't pass, didn't go through the whole process, but it was about this exact type of activity. What is our own scope 3 as a state? So this gets us started. The big bright red that you see on this slide are those sectors, healthcare and construction, that make up a big chunk of the spend of the state. And that's why we started talking about healthcare in the last webinar, webinar number 2. You can go back and listen to that. It was a great webinar talking about all of the different suppliers into the UC medical schools. Many of those suppliers are members of the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, which you all might want to look into. And they're part of this initiative called CHARM. So the entire healthcare industry, because hospitals like Common Spirit and Kaiser and Mayo and Cleveland Clinic have gotten together and they're connecting health and wellness to climate change. And they're looking at their own footprint. And like the UK National Health Service, they're looking at their supply chain. These logos that you see are part of that supply chain. So with that being said, I do want to bring in Tyson. He's been having some technical issues, so he might not be on video with us today. But Tyson, I've got you up here first. I wanted to dig into a little bit of the construction sector for today's webinar because of the research you all been doing. So Tyson, you want to go ahead and give us a little bit of detail about who you are, and then we're going to go into your slides.
Thank you so much, Mike. Happy to be here today. Apologies, I'm having some hardware issues, so I won't be on camera. My name is Tyson Timmer. I'm a PhD candidate here at UCLA. I do research with the Center for Impact at the Anderson School of Management and with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. We have been working on this project called Open for Good, which has been looking at, for the past 5 years now, looking at public disclosures from the S&P 500 companies around a various set of environmental and social, broadly considered sustainability metrics. This has provided us a lot of insights, both to share with you all today, as well as research that we do, looking at what is the state of corporate disclosure, how are companies disclosing things, what sectors are disclosing things, what sectors aren't disclosing things. And it's been very revelatory and very interesting to look at. You can see here with the Open for Good initiative, the set of metrics that we're currently collecting. Recently, we've decided to pare it down a little bit to environmental metrics. We'll focus on the environmental metrics and expand what we're looking at. And this has really been in line with some of the focus industries had, as well as governments, particularly around, as Mike mentioned, the state of California and legislation around disclosure. If you can go to the next slide, Mike. So since we're talking about supply chains, we want to really focus on greenhouse gas emissions. And just a really quick recap, greenhouse gas emissions under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol are measured in 3 scopes. Scope 1 being a firm's direct emissions, Scope 2 being indirect emissions from electricity or purchased heat, purchased steam, things like that. And then Scope 3 is everything else. So you can imagine Scope 3 being everything upstream of what a firm, the products and services a firm provides, and everything downstream of that. And just to level set here, so when we look at the S&P 500 companies, we're using the GICS sector classification system. And what's challenging in the real estate and construction space is those firms typically fall into 2 different sectors, one being real estate and one being consumer discretionary. Consumer discretionary is typically where builders and home builders fall, but sometimes they fall in real estate. Real estate is classically, REITs and REIT structured companies, but this consumer discretionary is a very large one. So you can see here in this figure, this is comparing Scope 1 emissions by sector for 2022 and 2023 reporting. And you can see that consumer discretionary and real estate are really low on this curve when it comes to Scope 1 emissions. But as you can imagine, that makes a lot of sense because they're not burning a lot of fuel themselves. They're usually using purchased electricity, which would be Scope 2, as well as their bigger impact being their Scope 3, their indirect emissions. So if you can go to the next slide, Mike. And just a reminder, Scope 3 dominates both these sectors. Here you can see what we look at for companies in the S&P 500 that are disclosing their Scope 3 emissions, which of the categories of Scope 3 they're disclosing. Again, to level set, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol divides up Scope 3 into 15 categories. And you can see things like business travel and purchased goods and services being what companies are typically disclosing. Although you can see that less than half of S&P 500 companies actually disclose their Scope 3 categories. And apologies, I think I lost my audio connection.
We can still hear you on
Oh,
our
that's great.
Hello.
And you can imagine, am I back?
Yeah,
Sorry,
you can.
Mike.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah. So you can imagine when it comes to real estate, where most of their emissions are going to be, because it's a very long-lived asset. You know, people are going to be in a building for a very long time. That it's going to be, you can see here, the use of products sold would be the dominant category, the dominant emission source for a lot of these companies. And you can see here about halfway down this list, only about 24.5% of S&P 500 companies are actually disclosing the emissions from the use of products sold. Mike, if you can go to the next slide. So stepping away from talking about measuring emissions, but also the other aspects of climate and greenhouse gas emissions, we also look at transition planning and climate risks. You can see here on the top kind of left figure what the percentage of consumer discretionary or real estate companies in the S&P 500 that are discussing climate transition plans is part of their public-facing disclosures. You can see, less than 20% of the companies that fall into those sectors in the S&P 500 are talking about transition plans. On the figure on the bottom right, we're talking about climate-related risks, and this is for all S&P 500 companies. But when they're talking about risks, what are they talking about? And we have it divided up here into kind of two broad categories: acute physical risks and chronic physical risks, and then non-physical risks. So policy risk, market risk, reputational risk, and technology risks. And again, with the companies in the S&P 500, less than half of companies are actually discussing their climate-related risks. You can go to the next slide, Mike. And then the last thing we look at in kind of the climate category is board-level competencies. So these are the most senior decision makers at firms, and what are companies discussing when it comes to the competencies that their board members as it relates to environmental competencies. And again, here you can see consumer discretionary and real estate that I've pointed out here. In consumer discretionary, over half of board members aren't identified as having any environmental expertise. And in real estate, almost 75% of companies aren't talking about any of their board members' environmental expertise. So a lot of people that are sitting on the board that aren't necessarily experts or have the necessary background, whether it be work or education, that would be able to inform, climate reporting, climate transition plans, or climate risk. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Mike.
Your last slide, Tyson, and
thank you.
Teresa threw it in there to make sure we give it a good shout out.
Yeah, we also wanted to invite you all to join the OFG for Insights in our climate risk panel. We're talking about this as part of the Fall Economic Outlook here at Anderson. You can see a link there as well as a QR code. You can always look at the Open for Good reports on our website. If you search Open for Good Anderson or Open for Good Center for Impact, you can find all of our historical reports as well as interactive dashboards. We love talking to people about the data we're collecting and the research that we're doing. So hopefully we can connect with you all some more.
Excellent. Thanks, Tyson. We're going to hold on questions for you until we come back to the group. I'm going to segue over to Tim and let him introduce himself. And again, anyone out there, if you want to load questions in, you're welcome to. Teresa is loading some links to you all as additional resources. We're going to build the story up, and we're going to come to Deanne, who will then talk about board level engagement. After Tim, we have Raven, an expert from Granite Construction, who will explain to us what's really going on at a company level. But Tim, tell us a little bit more about your center, what you do in relationship to Open for Good, if anything at all. This falls under a much larger umbrella with the various players that are out there around the UCLA family.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Delighted to be here. Tim Kawahara, Executive Director of what's called the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. We are a multidisciplinary research center, which is a joint center of the business school here, the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and the UCLA School of Law. But we also have partnerships across the entire campus in urban planning and policy and architecture and economics and geography and engineering and medicine and public health and several others across the campus too. So we take a very holistic look at real estate, and certainly issues like this, they're not siloed in any one of these industries. They really need to be part of all of these disciplines when we come together and figure out how to tackle some of these global issues. I'm delighted that you've chosen real estate to be one of the supply chain scope 3 discussions as part of the webinar series. As many of you may know, the real estate industry and the built environment accounts for roughly 40% of the global carbon footprint. So absolutely, the real estate industry needs to be a part of the solutions here if we're going to really make a dent on a global basis. This also wanted to mention that, I'm representing the real estate industry itself. I know Raven can speak to that a little bit too from the construction side, but there are a lot of drivers. It's not just regulation. It's also the capital providers. A lot of capital providers are requiring green buildings and that these companies actually tackle these issues. So we have to look at the business drivers as well. And of course, on the business side, we're always trying to balance meeting regulations and doing the right thing, but also being able to keep the economy going and maintain jobs and ensure that these businesses are viable at the same time. So always a balance that we're looking at. I also just wanted to mention that we have a very close partnership with what's called the C Solutions, Climate Solutions Center here at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And just wanted to remind everybody that in addition to this conversation being about climate change and sustainability, this is also really a huge public issue, a public health issue that I don't think we can forget. When we think about the built environment and how climate is changing it, for example, extreme heat events are the largest killer of humans of any natural disaster. And if we don't start doing things like mitigating for that and some of the climate change that are impacting public health, so it's important, obviously, to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions and everything else, but there's also a human element and there's really a public health element to this whole thing as well. I just wanted to bring up a couple pieces of legislation that's on the mind of the real estate industry right now, in particular the industrial and logistics industry. Both are pieces of legislation that are about to be enacted or implemented here in the state of California. One is a statewide bill called AB Assembly Bill 98. That is going to regulate future warehouse design, trucking lanes, entry gates, landscaping, a whole bunch of different things. And in particular, ensuring that these warehouse and high pollutant facilities are not located near sensitive locations like residential neighborhoods and schools and parks and that kind of thing. But there's going to be a huge shift in adaptation and switch to things like electric trucking and things like that. So that's something that's very much on the mind of the real estate industry. Another one that is more local here in Los Angeles is SB 34, Senate Bill 34. And that's tackling carbon emissions specifically with the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. Many people may not realize, but by far and away, the largest emitter of air pollution in the region are those two ports combined. So obviously there's been some focus at the state level to attack that as well. So SB 34 will be, I think it's going through the legislature right now, but that's going to require, CARB, you mentioned earlier, Mike, is going to have a larger role in defining how to regulate the emissions there. Going back to the public health issue, I can tell you that the neighborhoods around the Port of LA and neighborhood have a 50% higher rate of cancer, for example. So these are really issues that are large and public health oriented as well as carbon emission oriented. But those are two bills that the industry has its eye on and figuring out how they're going to be able to accommodate and what it means exactly. And that will be coming, these issues will be thought about in the next couple of years as we roll out the pieces of legislation. And other than that, happy to join in any other future conversation about how the industry views all of this and sort of best practices in construction supply chain. I know that Raven's probably going to talk about a lot of that, but I will stop there. I apologize for not having fancy slides like the rest of the group, but I'm happy to be on and answer any questions that you may have in the Q&A function. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate that. One thing I do want to ask you right now is the accounting question about that financed emissions. If a deal's coming together, there might be the general contractor and all the subcontractors, but there's financing. How is that being accounted for, and how does the center work on that type of math?
Yeah, well, so I mean, virtually every large real estate company today now has a chief sustainability officer. And so they're taking into account not just the regulatory issues and what capital providers are providing, but in many instances, there are cost savings associated with implementing some of these things too. So yes, there are the accountants that are sharpening their pencils, and they are really looking at how some of this stuff is going to save the company and have the company perform at a higher level. I think what we've seen, I think when we first started seeing green building, it was really done just sort of as a do-good kind of a thing. It was the right thing to do. But now we are actually seeing return on investment on a lot of these technologies. So yes, these companies are definitely looking at it. The capital providers are looking at this, and they are choosing to implement some of these emission issues like green building because it makes financial sense.
That's great.
And I just also mentioned too that our center has done a lot of work on the wildfire recovery here in Los Angeles. And that's going to be a huge issue when it comes to procurement of building materials and logistics. And you're going to have, literally hundreds and thousands of trucks and contractors and developers going in these two burn zones. And I'm hopeful that there'll be some conversation about the broader issue of logistics and supply chain and sustainability with regard to this massive rebuild that's going to happen in Los Angeles.
Very good points, Tim. We'll come back to some of that accounting a little bit later. Once we bring in Raven and get a little bit deeper into this. So Raven, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the work at Granite, how it fits in today's story.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share a little bit about Granite, our sustainability program, and our perspective on supplier reporting in the construction industry. And thank you to everyone in our audience for being here. My name is Raven Adams. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Granite, and just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You can go to the next slide. At Granite, we build infrastructure. We just mentioned emergency work, recovering from fires, mudslides. We do a lot of that type of work as well, helping our communities recover from those extreme events. But we build roads, highways, bridges, water and wastewater infrastructure, building dams, decommissioning dams, solar, basically all types of civil infrastructure that keeps society functioning. Those are the things that we build. Granite was incorporated in 1922, and we are one of the largest diversified construction and construction materials companies in the United States, with about $4 billion of revenue last year. Sustainability is one of our core values, and we're publicly traded. Our ticker symbol is GVA. So you'll see in our most recent sustainability report, we had a play on that with the theme of SVA for sustainability value add, because that's our view on sustainability. And that's also the theme of our most recent sustainability strategy. You can go back to the previous slide still. Our strategic objective is to leverage sustainability as a competitive advantage, and we have three major areas as we take a very broad view of sustainability: social responsibility, environmental stewardship, and dependable governance. So today we're focusing on the environmental side with carbon reporting and Scope 3 supplier requests. And so in this area, we're seeing increased demands and requirements from clients, and these come in a few different formats. First, supplier questionnaires. Second, Scope 3 requests. Those typically come through the CDP reporting requests. We also see more and more requests for qualifications or requests for information. And those are typically at kind of a higher level, asking, do we have a sustainability program? Do we report our own greenhouse gas emissions? And finally, we have requests related to specific projects. And that's typically where clients will ask us to report fuel use for a particular project. So we'll get into those details a little bit later. And on the regulatory side, we are subject to the California requirements. We're headquartered in California and have our historical roots there. You can go ahead to the next slide. Broadly, Granite sustainability strategy is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs or the global goals. And I just like to kind of zoom out to show the big picture here, because this is where we often find that alignment with our clients, is that bigger picture mission of making a more sustainable future for everyone. And we find this common ground as the starting point for deeper engagement. And then we'll dive into the details around climate and carbon reporting. And my favorite goal, so you see all 17 here. The ones in color are the ones we're particularly focused on because they're most relevant to our business. But you'll see the last one, number 17, that's probably my favorite, partnership for the goals, because we like to focus on having strategic sustainability partnerships with our clients and other stakeholders that help us work together to advance shared sustainability goals. You can go ahead to the next slide. One thing I want to focus on today is the importance of procurement or contracting methods for the outcomes we're able to achieve in sustainability in the built environment, but particularly in infrastructure. And if you're not intimately involved in this space and familiar with these different kind of procurement or contracting methods, historically, the typical contracting or procurement method is called sort of low bid or bid build. And that's where a project will be almost completely designed, and then that design will be put out to contractors to bid on. And typically it will just go to the lowest cost bidder. I've started to think of low bid as kind of the enemy of sustainability because it really limits the opportunity to improve sustainability outcomes. There are these newer contracting methods that kind of collectively we call collaborative contracting methods. There's a lot of different acronyms in this space. One of the most common would be CMGC, Construction Manager General Contractor. But what all of these different methods have in common is that they allow the contractor to be involved earlier in the life cycle of a project. And that means you can get that construction perspective on design early and impact things like sustainability outcomes earlier in a more cost-effective way. And the reason for this is depicted in this graphic you see on the left that shows that as a project timeline progresses, our ability to make changes decreases over time, while the cost to make changes increases over time. So what I sometimes find as a kind of typical misconception about sustainability is that people think, well, if I want to be more sustainable, I'm going to have to spend more money. And I think this sometimes comes from an attempt to add sustainability after the fact, after something is designed, late in the life cycle of a project, and think, well, let's make some changes to make it more sustainable. But at that point, it's very costly to make those changes. Whereas in my experience, if you're involved earlier in the design process, you can make those changes to make things more sustainable. And you can do it not only in a more cost-effective manner, but sometimes even saving money for the client. So overall, you're able to increase efficiency. So with things like natural resource use, water, fuel use, ultimately emissions, which we're focused on today, but also reduce other negative impacts, not just in the environmental space, but also in the social space. So things that neighborhoods near construction projects worry about, like noise, dust, increased traffic. If you are involved earlier in the project as a contractor, you can help plan things in ways that minimize and mitigate those negative impacts on the surrounding community. And overall, you can do this in ways that lower costs for the client. So the best partnerships that I've been a part of have been on projects that really leverage this collaborative contracting method. And we've been able to collaborate to have better sustainability outcomes. Go ahead to the next slide. So since we're focused on carbon reporting, I want to share two resources today that might be useful for those of you who want to kind of dive a little bit deeper. The first is Envision. You've likely heard of LEED or seen LEED emblems when you walk into a building. That's the framework for recognizing sustainability in buildings. And Envision is like LEED, but for infrastructure projects. And it has 5 different categories, 2 of which are really relevant in this space: resource allocation and climate and resilience. And looking at the spectrum of achievement in these categories, they break things down into different credit areas where you can really see the interplay of resource use in the construction itself and how that plays into climate and resilience and overall reducing the carbon footprint of a project. So that really helps break down the areas of opportunity there. The second resource is the AGC decarb playbook, Associated General Contractors, and I was part of the task force that helped develop this resource. And basically, it helps contractors understand the breakdown of reporting at the project level. So things can get really complicated with contractors, subcontractors, how you account for different types of emissions in different parts of the project lifecycle. And this is probably the best resource that we have in the industry for understanding how to tackle those things head on. If you go ahead to the next slide, please. This graphic is actually from that playbook, and it's helpful to visualize the project life cycle in terms of the different phases and the life cycle assessment phases. So in the product phase, this is where we look at the materials used in construction. So things like asphalt, concrete, steel, and the information about the carbon footprint of those materials is best obtained through environmental product declarations, or EPDs. Then we have the construction phase, and that's what contractors like us would need to track, hopefully using the playbook. And clients would want part of that information from contractors to help account for their own Scope 3 footprint. And this is where sometimes we have those client requests I mentioned earlier around fuel tracking. And that's something that's really best to address early on when you set up the contract to understand that there's a responsibility to be tracking that information, because it's not always done in the normal course of business. Sometimes these come about for local air requirements for a project in terms of tracking emissions and staying within certain limits. Then you have the use and maintenance phase, as well as the end of life phase, and those are definitely impacted by design. So you want to assess the different options that you have, particularly for using different materials, what the maintenance will look like, what's going to happen to the materials at the end of the project's life. And those are things that, again, the client would want to track as part of their overall Scope 3 carbon footprint. You can go ahead to the next slide. So I quickly just want to bring this. Oh, are you okay, Mike?
Yeah, I had a question for you about some of the collaborations that you brought up there.
Yes.
So you're talking about several different resources of groups of people. What about the design level? Like, you're working with architects too, but they're not necessarily directly involved with you, or are they? What's that relationship?
It will be.
They will.
Yes. And so actually, for those of you who want kind of all the details on the different kinds of contracting methods, in the appendix, I don't think you have to bring it up now, but in the appendix, I kind of break all of this down for those of you who kind of want to dive a little deeper. But one of the great things about these collaborative contracting methods is that it brings the designer into the room with us. So we're working with the client and the designer and the contractor all together to have that collaborative conversation and essentially have the contractor's input influence the design. So we're making those design changes together.
If we think about the front end of this webinar, and what inspired this is this idea of a public institution, a public agency procuring things. You are receiving that across the country, if not the world, from public agencies, correct? And are they asking you specifically for greenhouse gas emissions data for your project or for your work?
I would say it's on the rise. And so we do a lot of public work, right? So we build the public infrastructure that helps connect our communities, give us things like clean water. And I'd say the increases there, we have some requirements in California now through Caltrans that are requiring environmental product declarations for certain types of materials. So that's one of the first ways we've seen requirements specifically related to carbon footprints. So that's a great trend from my perspective. And then we do see increased questions from some clients. I would say on the public agency side, things have mostly been focused on EPDs on that material phase, but there's kind of increasing engagement and more conversations happening about these things.
Got it. Great.
And certainly for air emissions in California, many projects do have requirements there that then would require us to be tracking fuel use to make sure we stay within those limits.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'll let you get back to it.
So just to kind of bring this all in, from the hypothetical to the real, I wanted to share some examples from a recent project that's still actually ongoing. So these numbers are really a snapshot in time and actually will probably increase over time when we hit the end of the project. This is from a large rail project in Chicago. And this was a CMGC project where we were able to be involved in the design conversation from the very beginning. And through this increased collaboration with the client and the designer, we were able to optimize site grading, which is how you're leveling out, doing that earthwork, moving soil around the site essentially, to reduce excavation by 11,000 cubic yards. So that means less time of equipment using fuel to move soil around. We recycled over 86,000 tons of existing aggregate base material. We repurposed over 319,000 tons of surplus soil onto an adjacent client property. What that means is that all of this impacted soil that needed to be removed from the site, instead of trucking it a very long distance to a waste facility and paying those quite expensive waste tickets for it to be processed, we were actually able to move it to a nearby adjacent client property. And that soil is actually being used to kind of level the earthwork that was needed for a different project. And we actually saved so much money from avoiding those waste tickets that the client was able to fund a whole nother project on a different site. And overall, all of this combined to avoid more than 1.4 million truck miles. So this is hauling all of that material, helped avoid over 1.4 million, which is kind of a staggering number. I had to have the engineers double and triple check that math because it was just amazing to me. And all of the associated emissions with those trucks. And besides just emissions, that's also, trucks on the roads that impact the neighborhoods surrounding the site. So really kind of amazing impacts in this project. If you go to the next slide, just quickly share that, part of this came through material recycling. So this project recycled all the concrete and steel, asphalt and steel rail generated during the demolition of the project. And that impacts hauling. And then finally, another initiative we have that is kind of spreading throughout the company. Typically, small tools are run either from their own direct fuel source or if they're electric, charged from a fuel generator. And at this project, it was one of the first we had that switched all of the small tools to electric versions. And then the team actually built the solar array you see pictured to hook it up to a solar powered generator. And then all of the small tools were charged from that solar generator. So helping it reduce emissions on the project site. And then also had social benefits as well. So this helped mitigate exposure for the people using the tools from those exhaust emissions and the excess noise hazard. So actually some of the best feedback we received was from people using the tools saying, this is really great. It's so much quieter and I'm not breathing in those fumes all day. So it's kind of, it's small things, but when you're talking about construction, these small changes really add up. So we'll take any benefit we can get. And this is one of the initiatives that we're kind of spreading out throughout the company as we are on our climate journey here.
Raven, when I look at this particular one, I'm thinking these avoided emissions are valuable, right? I mean, not only are you saving fuel and fossil fuels by not driving and delivering things, but is there a way to monetize that and turn it into revenue in some way for Granite or for the project at this point?
Really, it ends up being savings for the client. Yeah. So ultimately, we're able to, we do have engineers that kind of track that in their, they call it value add, engineering. And they will kind of track all of these innovations. And, typically they have an innovation log that will show, okay, here are the changes that we made from what was maybe originally planned, and here's how much money it saves. So we do find through that collaborative contracting method, the opportunity for value engineering really increases. And ultimately, anytime you're paying for that earlier involvement in what we call, the pre-construction planning process, pays for itself many times. So ultimately the client ends up saving money because of all those value engineering decisions. So ultimately, for those examples, the client saved enough money to be able to fund another project.
Excellent.
And I have a quick question. Yeah, I have a quick question for Raven. Yeah, that may be interesting to the audience. Are you guys doing any manufactured or modular construction? Because I know that is also a tool to reduce on-site construction waste and pollution, and it's being manufactured in a facility, so it's a much cleaner way of building.
So we don't typically do many we do have some, but typically we're not doing too many buildings, which I think the most of those, pre-construction, prefabricated things I've seen in construction are typically with buildings. So it's possible, but I haven't had any direct experience with it yet. I do think for things like retaining walls or other pieces of projects, likely we're influencing those things, but I'd have to kind of check out with our project teams who have more on the ground experience.
Thank you.
So I want to bring on a special guest. Thank you, Raven. We're queuing up some Q&A for later on. We're at the 42-minute mark. I want to spend about 5 minutes introducing and bringing on Deanne Hurd, who's become a dear friend and colleague in this space. We're both members of the National Association of Corporate Directors. That's how we met in the first place. And Deanne's been part of that group's efforts to raise awareness at the board level about climate risk and carbon accounting. She's been on a couple of recent journeys physically over to Europe for some very important meetings I want to talk about, but she was also the connector to Raven because Deanne talked to me about something called the World Asphalt Summit or something like that, and we started talking about construction. So Deanne, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you got us to today's session with Raven and Granite.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Deanne Hurd, and my background's in law and finance. I've been CFO and general counsel of a whole series of companies from very large to very small. I sit on corporate boards and I also advise corporate boards, and much of my advisory work has been done through NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. It was because I was on the board of a road and bridge construction company, family-owned, private, Peckham Industries, that I went to the World of Asphalt conference, and I saw Raven speak, and she impressed me, as I'm sure she's impressing all of you, and talked to Mike about it, and here we are. But Mike, the important thing about board members and about NACD, quite frankly, is this wonderful partnership by and between NACD and UCLA. UCLA is part of NACD's education network. And for those of you that are on this call that are certified, have passed the certification exam that NACD provides, you get certification credits for being here today, and we can talk more about that later. But NACD is it's really the 800-pound gorilla in the corporate governance space. NACD has an upcoming summit, which will be at National Harbor outside of Washington, D.C. from October 12th to the 15th. It is a fascinating, scintillating symposium seminar, which brings together the corporate leaders that sit on boards in the United States and other individuals who would like to be on boards. And following that, UCLA will have, as they always do, their Directors Symposium. The chapters of NACD exist throughout the United States, and the Pacific Southwest chapter hosts this event every year. And we'll have a link to that available for you at some point. So it is a terrific partnership, and I'm very happy to be here today with my clock chiming. Forgive that, but sort of representing NACD. I'll also tell you that the World Economic Forum has put together an organization that they're calling the Corporate Governance Initiative. And Mike mentioned that I had been traveling. I was chosen as one of 2 board members to represent the United States in Geneva at the World Economic Forum's recent symposium. And I would say really workshop, developing corporate governance objectives and capabilities throughout the world. So that was a tremendous honor. I still don't know how I was chosen, but that's irrelevant. And a tremendous organization focused on climate and biodiversity. And I can pretty much tell you that in today's world, talk about suppliers, everyone is connected to the global economy, and we need to make sure that we understand that. So, Mike, what have I forgotten?
Well, dude, I'm interested in, your perspectives given your particular background. This idea of a large institution putting out an RFP and asking suppliers, potential suppliers, in a bidding process, is that something that's talked about in the boardroom? Are people aware that climate change is part of a sale in this day and age?
Absolutely, positively. In the boardroom, I was thinking as Raven was talking, what does this have to do with the board of directors? Well, the board is concerned about compliance. The board is concerned about risk. But most importantly, the board is concerned about the opportunities that climate change and biodiversity are affording companies. So yeah, the board is intimately involved in strategic decisions that the company is facing going forward. Now, you asked the question, does this level of granularity rise up to the board? I can tell you as a board member, yes. And the interesting thing is that boards today are having, presentations from people like Raven. And sometimes board members ask, why do we care about this? Why are we interested? And many times the CEO will say, we're interested because our principal customer in Brazil, in Saudi Arabia, wherever, has asked us for these metrics and so on and so forth. So yeah, the board is very interested in revenue, very interested. So revenue, strategy, risk, compliance, these are board issues for sure.
So Tyson, I want to put you on the spot just a little bit now that you're on camera too. I mean, it goes, from what I think, it goes a little counter to your slide that shows the governance awareness. But am I missing something with that slide?
Well, keep in mind that we're looking at public disclosure. So in the case of the board, we're looking at what companies talk about in their proxy statements about their board members.
Okay.
So we're not going out and like doing a background check on each board member to see where we're capturing what companies highlight about their board members.
Okay.
I would also say, as we're talking about here, there's been a rapid increase in the attention given to and the amount of time spent on climate issues. And as we're working off reports that are typically published a couple of quarters, 3 quarters after the end of the year, which reflect the previous year. We are working on a bit of a time delay.
Got it. Yeah, so that's publicly available information from publicly traded companies is different than private companies. We certainly know that. And in the construction area, there tend to be a lot more private companies. Tim, are you seeing similar things at the board level with your members of your center, and our boards aware?
Yeah, I am. Like I said, our folks, and we have folks that are heads of public and private companies, and they're all interested in this issue. As I mentioned earlier, a lot because of the CalPER providers are demanding it. But I think we also, when you're talking about going back to what Deanne said, the board members being obviously interested in the performance of the company. On the real estate sector, you're seeing tenants demand clean building as well. So when you're talking about your absolute customer base and what they're demanding out of a building when they're signing leases, it's important to know that the tenants are driving a lot of this as well. And then to your earlier question about some of the financing mechanisms, there are several financing mechanisms that are available, like we call them green financing or green banking. There are green bonds. There are programs like CPACE and cap and trade and a bunch of other things too that are incentivizing investment in some of these green spaces as well, just to get back to your initial question.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. Deanne, you were going to say something?
The only thing I was going to point out is what Tyson was really talking about is the disclosures that tie to whether or not the individual board members have climate background. And I can tell you those numbers are correct that Tyson showed. But I'll also say, as board members, you don't need to have a climate background to be asking questions about climate, right? So the two match together quite well. Boards should have somebody on the board that has some type of expertise, but all of the things that climate touches are board level questions, regardless.
Yeah, some of the public companies that I work with that are in the, say, industrial space, they are specifically looking for board members with expertise in sustainability.
Right.
That's good to go. Yeah. I mean, so I got to know NACD during my time with the Global Reporting Initiative and started doing training on sustainability and reporting. And that's how I got to know Deanne and the crew that are part of the NACD family. Literally done trainings for board members on carbon accounting, but also on GRI and sustainability reporting. So it is getting into that group of people, a large number of people. I think NACD membership's 20,000 at this point, Deanne. And it's actually shifted. My understanding is it from public companies to more private companies as well. And the point we wanted to make with today is this is a boardroom level issue. If you're tuning in because you're working in the field, which you obviously are, and you want to think about your long-term career trajectory, maybe you want to be on a board of directors at some point. The fact that UCLA Anderson is doing this series of webinars and it is already connected to NACD and these upcoming events are happening this fall, it's a perfect time for you all to get involved through these types of board level governance programs. I got a few questions in the queue that I want to bring in, but before I do that, Raven, I wanted to ask you about your own board and how you're interacting with them. Is it something that you're doing a lot of? Is it quarterly? And what are they gaining from your knowledge?
Yes. So the way that we have our governance structure set up around sustainability, which includes all of these climate issues, is that ultimately the board is responsible for our performance and how we manage these things, and that happens through me up through what we call our executive committee, which is our highest leadership level team in terms of management. That includes our president and CEO. And I report up to our executive committee at least quarterly, and then as delegated by them to our board of directors, which again happens essentially probably more frequent in reality than quarterly. But we run that through one of our board committees, and the governance has me updating them, that committee at least 2 times a year, and the full board of directors at least 2 times a year. Ultimately, it ends up being a little bit more frequent than that with things like monthly board memos. But essentially, I have that kind of direct line through the executive committee to our board of directors, and some of our, I think, most in-depth and animated discussions about, really what does the company stand for, have revolved around sustainability. So I'd say our board of directors is very engaged in these issues, and it's a high priority for them.
Well, thanks for that feedback on that. So a couple of questions. I want to just quickly make sure we address these. I got a note in here about, is there anything going on to incentivize or facilitate material reuse in projects? And that's for Tim and or Raven. How is the market being incentivized to reuse?
That's probably more of a question for Raven in terms of waste management.
Yeah, I'd say.
Raven,
go ahead.
Also RAP, right? Recycled asphalt pavement.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought it up. So yeah, that's probably our biggest talking point in the asphalt industry is RAP, recycled asphalt pavement. And so that's where that's part of the demolition. So the question is kind of asking for things other than that. But the way that works, in case people aren't aware, is asphalt is kind of infinitely recyclable. So the roads that we build, you can kind of break up that asphalt and then you reprocess it in an asphalt plant. Asphalt is basically aggregate and sand, heated up with asphalt oil, which is itself a petroleum product, kind of the bottom of the barrel, that black stuff that makes everything stick together. But when you recycle asphalt in that way, you're not only reusing the aggregate itself, which means you have the opportunity to dig up less new virgin aggregate, which uses a lot of fuel in that process, but also you're reusing that asphalt oil, so saving having to use that other petroleum product. I'd say this is probably one of the lowest hanging fruits in the industry where we have an opportunity to improve by using increased percentages of RAP in our asphalt mixes. And anyone who's a taxpayer on this call, we all have an interest in, it's not something people tend to think about, but in using more recycled materials in our roads because it helps us all overall reduce the carbon footprint.
There's also more technology going into the development of building materials that makes them more recyclable. I mean, there's a lot of work on concrete, for example. And so there's a lot of stuff that's happening on the front end as well.
And Tim,
I think that's right.
There's another question kind of similar about the reuse or their use of renewable fuels too, and that being incentivized. And Tim, you mentioned the port activity as well as some laws that are pending here in California.
Yeah, that's some of
incentivized.
That's part of a couple of those bills. It's a move to electrify fleets or go to hydrogen fleets and phase out fossil fuel powered trucks and vehicles ultimately. And of course, we had in California, there was a goal to phase out, all fossil fuel cars and go to completely EVs at some point. But I think we've backed off that a little bit. But certainly there is an effort to do more renewable fuels for trucking, transportation, construction vehicles. That's, slow moving, but that's definitely a goal.
Tyson, to see you raising your hand.
Oh, sorry. I don't know how I did that.
No worries.
I see on the renewable fuel side.
Couple of minutes left. I want to touch on a couple of things that I picked up on. Raven, you're talking about things with publicly traded companies, so I would suspect you're working with investor relations, with regulations emerging, general counsel, corporate secretary are more involved. What about finance, accounting, and verification of this information? Are you talking to them much?
Absolutely. So I kind of work with everyone all throughout the company. Structurally, I actually sit under our CFO. So I'm very well tied into the financial part of our organization. And, especially with things moving into the compliance space, I'm working increasingly so with our financial reporting team and going through that process to get ready for assurance and also ultimately have all of this information verified and assured just in the same way that our financials are.
And Deanna, put you on the spot a little bit. There are different groups or committees within a board, and that can range from different industries and just the setup itself. But what are the main committees that might be working on sustainability at the board level?
Well, there are really three formations. One is that you have a full board, working. A second one would be that you actually have on the board a sustainability committee. And then the third, and what's becoming quite prevalent, is the nominating and governance committee takes this over and under the umbrella of governance. But one thing that's happening, and Mike, you and I have talked about this, there's a new position out there called a sustainability controller, And really, when you think about risk, that's audit committee. So it's very interesting. Those companies that sort of have a full board approach, they break it down into the existing committees, compensation, audit, and nominating and governance. But one committee, it would be NomGov or a special committee.
Great. A great way to end it. I want to thank everybody that tuned in today. We had a really good hang time with the attendees. We'll get this recording to all of you as well as those that registered. That'll include the slides. We might do a little bit of tailoring of the slides if we need to. But I want to thank all of my panelists for being with us today. The UCLA team for sure for this being the third of four. So stay tuned for the fourth one. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.